4 p.m.
Right. No, y'all go ahead.
Yeah. So, you know, we're doing this in several different countries, basically.
Yes, wonderful. What technology? Yeah, you think years ago we would have had this? Who would have known?
True.
Mm-hmm.
Well, also it's a pandemic which has made it not acceptable.
Yes, exactly.
Which is something we wouldn't have thought of, actually.
I see Clinton. Hi, Clinton.
Everybody say Sean is on as well. Well, Thomas, Faye, Clinton. You have people here, man.
Hello to everyone from Trinidad.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hi.
9:59, so we just wait until 10 to start. I mean, if you all are starting on the dot, up to you all.
Hi, Carlton.
How are you?
Good. I sent something on the link to you about the feud between the English and the French. I sent you something.
And I certainly enjoyed that, and it was really an extension in terms of pushing back the boundaries to get a flavor, because Anthony Burgess in his book has really stood back, because he left England and was in France, so he got a flavor of the French.
Yes.
So he writes extensively in that, but I like to, because I always say history is not a straight line.
Yes.
And as we extend our boundaries, the vertices along the way gives us the ability to see all the nuances of our history. But I would pause there. This is your show.
Yes, exactly. I know.
Okay, well, it's 10:01, so I guess over to Indrani and Julie.
Okay, yes. And you will mute us, right?
No, you'll go ahead and mute yourself.
Okay.
Go ahead and mute yourselves. Because if I do a global mute, I'm going to mute Indrani and Julie, and I don't want to confuse anybody. So just mute yourselves. I'll mute as well. Over to you, Indrani.
Okay. Researching our North and South Indian ancestors in Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean. Good morning to our viewers who are in Trinidad and Tobago and the rest of the Americas. Good afternoon if you're in Europe or Africa, and good night if you're in Australia, Asia. We sincerely wish to thank Anne Dardane and the rest of the team of the Trinidad and Tobago Genealogy Group for having invited my sister Julie Samnadda and myself to deliver this presentation to you. We are honored. The immigration of Indians to Trinidad is a complex matter. Why? This is what we will seek to explain to you in a moment, but suffice it to say that it is wrought with complexity. There were men, women, boys, girls, infants, all castes included, Hindus, Muslims, Christians, bankrupt landowners, jobless craftsmen, goldsmiths, silversmiths, exhausted farmers, couples running away from parental authority or fleeing persecution, young people looking for change and adventure. They came from the north to the south, from Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, from Bengal and Punjab down to Tamil Nadu. The Indians that came to Trinidad under the indentureship system from 1845 to 1917, during a period of 72 years, will not always have landed in Trinidad first, but will have gone to other destinations such as Guadeloupe, Martinique, British and French Guyana, Suriname, and to a lesser extent, St. Vincent, Grenada, and Jamaica. Some of them will have decided to make a further passage on to Trinidad for various reasons. For instance, Indian immigration to the French West Indies spread over a period of 31 years from 1854 to 1885. There is said to have been one mysterious convoy called the Nantes-Bordeaux, which was the last boat that arrived in Guadeloupe in 1889, carrying on board Indians who were free of any engagement, meaning that, unlike the others, they were not coming with a signed work contract for a plantation. The arrival of this boat appears to have been an inexplicable historical accident, since Indian immigration to the French West Indies was stopped 4 years before in 1885. The estates in Trinidad that the Indians will have gone to evolved over time. Just to give you an idea, the Indians who arrived in 1917 were assigned to some of the following estates: Williamsville, Petit Morne, Caroni, Taruba, Cedar Hill, Brecon Castle, Union Hall, Picton, Waterloo, Esperanza, Perseverance, Orange Grove, Bronte, Forest Park, and La Vega. And with this, I am very excited to pass the hand to my sister Julie, who will share with you the indicators which we are confident will help you to decrypt your ancestral past. This is based on our own research and first-hand experience. Thank you. Julie?
Okay, thank you very much for that brilliant introduction, Indrani. I'd like to thank the group once again for giving us this opportunity. I stumbled upon this group almost 3 years ago now, and it has changed my approach to my pet project. It has opened my eyes to ways of doing the things that I didn't know existed. I found a short clip on YouTube, an interview of a very old woman, and I took the liberty of asking Rene to use 1.5 minutes of this clip as before I start. Rene?
Your mother and father from India?
Yeah.
Right.
My mother and father in India, in Tanjavur. Tanjavur, Ramapatam. Devakar. She should tell me and I have to learn.
Anybody went back there?
No, nobody ever. I grieving to see my mother country. Whatever.
Yeah, you never.
I just study my mother and my father. Sometimes I sit down and study them.
So you wish you could have go back to India?
And they will mind me.
पंडित के कौन नाम है तमिल में?
Pandit.
पंडित.
Purohit or Pujari or what?
Sami.
Sami.
Sami. Sami.
Sami mean Pandit?
Yeah.
Sami.
Sami means Pandit.
Yeah.
Like Hori still have Swami and then now Sami is a Urdu word. Swami is a Hindi word. But you all correspond to one another right here.
No,
No, the Sami is the Pandit in Tamil.
Yeah.
Right? And
Sami. Sami.
Sami means
It's a
Pandit.
Right.
Now, first slide, please, Rene. That little clip encapsulates the entire problem we have in looking at the Indian immigration to Trinidad. A multitude of languages, not just North Indian languages, but South Indian languages, a variety of regions, and a place we are today in 2022 where very few of us are capable of either speaking those languages or have family alive that we can interview. So you will find on YouTube lots of clips like that, and I urge you to go on YouTube and have a look. Now, in that little clip, there are two words used in two different languages, Sami and Swami. And they denote names in our culture, in Trinidad, not necessarily elsewhere. And you will see that one of the biggest hurdles we have to overcome is what is our name? So I will start by giving you an overview on the routes taken not just to Trinidad, but elsewhere, what the naming traditions and languages were before arrival, what exactly, if we can capture in time, what your name was at departure, and our quest in searching for our roots is to look for an emigration pass and or a name that looks like ours on a general register. And then I will try and help you, because this is part of our personal search. We have not yet arrived at a resolution for our own personal search. But the aim is now in the 21st century to try and find and match your 21st century family name with somebody that arrived in India. Next slide, Rene. Now, as you can see, they came from India and they went to a variety of destinations. This is now described as the Indian diaspora. And alongside these figures, whilst this has been disputed in the past, it now appears that examination of the documents available in all national archives is that there were paying passengers that accompanied the indentured laborers on all of the ships. So although practically all of our ancestors were part of the indentured laborers system, it would appear that some of our ancestors were paying passengers. Finding out who those were, either in terms of the indentured laborers or the paying passengers, is what we hope to achieve. And it is not easy. Now, the returnees went in both directions. They returned to India and then they came back. The last ships carrying returnees to India was in 1954. The majority of those who arrived failed to exercise their right of return. In fact, that right of return was not consistently applied throughout indentureship. Now, when you start on this quest, you have to think like an immigrant. You didn't want to come in the first place, now you don't want to leave. Or if you returned, you want to go back. Does this sound familiar to many of you? The yearning for home, and then when you go back home, no. You want to go back to the place where you had settled. That's a very common immigrant experience, and it was no different from them. So you have to sort of start thinking like an immigrant when you're trying to find your ancestors. One of the things that you have to bear in mind as well is that the terms changed over the years, the terms of engagement, that is, and the contracts were not consistent. But what appears apparent is that after 1885, and that for a system that began in 1845, the promise of a return passage was adhered to. Next slide, please. And now I'm showing you in the next few slides maps of India. And here you will see in the further slides where the people that left India came from. The bulk of them came from North India, with a significant small minority from South India. Now, this particular map shows you the areas, the slow process of annexation of the Indian subcontinent by the British. If you look, for example, at the area shaded in yellow, this was the area most affected by the disturbances of the Indian Mutiny in 1857, nowadays sometimes called the First Indian War of Independence. And as the next slides will show, that area also coincides with areas of India from which we had the most immigration. Next slide, please. Now, why does the global context matter? Well, because indentureship was conducted under largely the same terms across the world, although upon arrival, you would find that the conditions varied. Within the Caribbean, and this is key to us in Trinidad, there was a lot of movement, as my sister said, between, in particular, Guyana and Trinidad. There was a great deal of movement between Martinique and Guadeloupe to Trinidad, but not the other way around. The reason for that was that those recruited to Martinique and Guadeloupe were British subjects, as were the rest of the Indians. And once they'd completed their indentureship, they weren't treated as well as the conditions in Martinique and Guadeloupe were not conducive to them staying. So many of them came, and but that is really only applicable to those from South India. From North India, it would appear that the greatest sort of intra-Caribbean movement was between Guyana and Trinidad, Suriname and Guyana, Suriname and Trinidad. Now, the other reason why the global context matters is because of the recurrence of names in the Indian diaspora means that we have developed a stock of surnames which you can identify someone from the Indian immigrant indentureship diaspora quite easily, even when they're abroad, because those surnames are not really found amongst Indians who come from India. And a spelling developed of these names. So whereas Mutu can be spelt one way if you're from India, Mutu is spelt in a way that is easily recognizable if you come from the Caribbean. The other reason why the international context matters is because this Indian diaspora has been recognized by UNESCO in 2014, and as a result, there have been grants available for the study of the Indian diaspora movements. There's been a lot of academic scholarship in the last 20 years. In 2014, UNESCO, contrary to the advice of its own internal committee, committed this movement to the global memory, which is a project whereby certain movements of humanity over the last 100 years, including slavery, the Holocaust, etc., are committed to the world memory. Now, it's interesting to note that UNESCO actually advised against this initially, and Mauritius, which was a recipient of a large indentureship movement, Mauritius and India lobbied UNESCO to recognize the indentureship as part of the global memory. And the internal opinion of UNESCO said, well, we see this as nothing more than a modern mass migration movement, because the conditions were conducive to people bettering themselves, even though there were inconsistencies and it was unfairly applied in many instances. Now, the view of India prevailed, and as a result, there's been a flourishing of academic study into this field. There's been greater collection of statistics. There has been collaboration between archives in relation to indentured laborers, and as a result, it has become much easier to find your ancestors. It is still, though, a very complex exercise, and in particular, it would be good if that global collaboration could lead to opening up of archives in a way in which we can access them online, as opposed to having to go in situ to check the archives. Next slide, please. And here I'd like to illustrate my point as to why the global context matters. Here is an extract from the South African General Register. Now, most of the South African archives are online. And here you will see that in 1893, there are 3 persons on the same ship going from India to South Africa, the province of Natal. But they state they were residents of Trinidad, 3 of them on the same ship, presumably a family, although it's 1 female, 1 male, and another male. They all appear to be in their late 20s. Now, given that they say they're residents of Trinidad, we can assume certain things about them, that they had been resident in Trinidad, they returned to India. They didn't live in India long enough to be deemed to be residents of India when they re-engaged themselves to be indentured in South Africa. And we have evidence in our own archives of similar similarities to this, similar movements of people coming from Mauritius to Trinidad, coming from South Africa to Trinidad. So that is why when you are looking for your ancestors, you must always bear in mind that they may not just have come directly from India, that they may have settled in another colony before coming to Trinidad. Next slide, please. So where in India did they come from? Now, I've constructed this slide slightly differently for you to show you where in India they came from and where we have the greatest numbers. So in Trinidad, British Guyana, and Jamaica, the largest numbers come from North India, with a very small minority from South India, of which my sister and I form part, although we are largely South Indian, with some North Indian. However, the opposite is true of other colonies. So in South Africa, the majority were from South India, certainly the case in Martinique and Guadeloupe, but also Mauritius and Fiji. I would also add that Mauritius and Fiji have sizable minorities from North India, as does South Africa, but South Africa is certainly mainly South Indian. Then we have groups in the rest of the Caribbean, St. Lucia, St. Kitts, Grenada, St. Vincent, of course, Jamaica. But the numbers there are too few for at least me to have found anything about where they came from. But I'm sure others will be able to tell me if anyone is listening who comes from one of those areas. We are now, I think, beginning to find out more about the small islands. Now, as far as North India is concerned, I've listed the main areas there. And also Madras, which is in South India. It didn't stretch too far beyond the city of Madras. Whereas if you go to the next slide, please, Rene, you will see that as far as North India is concerned, and I got these statistics from the British Archives, it's Command Paper 384107. These are the most commonly reoccurring districts where North Indians have come from. Now, the table I can't see on the right should be, because I'm unable to see it because I'm unable to see the whole slide, it should be South India. I'm not sure if it is or it isn't, but there we have it. But of these in North India, the most popular were Azimfu, Basti, which doesn't appear on this slide, Ghazipur, Gonda, and also Junpur, which is this is the last one in the first box. Next slide, please. And here they didn't just come from the northeast as such. Some came from Bengal. Some came from the Bombay Presidency in Orissa, some as far as the Punjab, and yes, here we have the Madras areas. Now, the Madras areas, in contrast to the areas in North India, is a small area, whereas if you were coming from the northeast provinces, you could have come from as far as 800 miles or 1,200 kilometers from Calcutta. Now, I forgot to say that the two ports that were used were Calcutta and Madras. I think that is very well known. The point, though, to remember is that they came through Calcutta. They were not from Calcutta. There might be some who were from Calcutta, but Calcutta was a port through which they came. Next slide, please. Now, pre-arrival. Now, pre-arrival, you have to bear in mind that before you left, you would have come from somewhere, a region, a district, a town, and you would have adhered closely to whatever was your language and naming tradition. You make a break when you leave. So you have to distinguish what is the name that was used in Trinidad, how long it was used, but what was the name at the point of departure from India. Next slide. Now, this shows the areas in 1893. This shows a political map of India, and the northeast and northwest provinces stretch just below the bit in yellow, which says Rajputana. Now, anything that is in pink belongs to Britain. I think some of us will remember that. You know, when the map showed pink areas, it was the British Empire. So those areas which remain in yellow were princely states or not yet under British rule. From what I can see, practically no one came from princely states. A handful did, but generally speaking, people came from areas which were controlled by the British. Next slide, please. Here is a 19th century famine map of India. Now, if you look at the key, it tells you when there was famine in India in the 19th century. If you look at the key in relation to where the other maps where people came from India, you will see that the areas most heavily affected by famine happen to coincide with the areas that people left India for Trinidad or whichever other colony, especially in the 1870s, which was a period of great famine, not just in the north of India, but also, unusually, also in the south. Next slide. I think soon you'll get fed up with the maps, but I promise you this is the last one. Now, this is modern India in terms of its languages. Now, India has several languages. At least 24, which are officially recognized. Now, the areas that Indian immigrants came from, in the north, the languages spoken were Hindu, Urdu, and Bhojpuri, which is a dialect of Hindi. In complete contrast, as you heard from the old lady at the start of this talk, in South India, they speak a completely different language, which resembles only in part, but otherwise is very different in terms of structure and syntax. They speak Tamil in Tamil Nadu, but also in other parts of South India from which immigrants came. They speak Telugu, Kannada, and Konkani. So people arriving spoke a variety of languages, and language and region were the best indicators of origin. Next slide, please. Departure. And so we come now to the point of departure. Next slide. Now, the aim is to match your current name with a person whose emigration pass is available at the National Archives, and which in due course will be digitized. It has been promised. Apparently they have been scanned. They've been digitized. They haven't yet been put online. Or if the emigration pass is not available at the National Archives, and I will come on to what emigration pass is in a moment, to match your current name, which is a name on the General Register, which is a list of all names. Now, there was no single naming tradition in India in 1845 to 1917. People came from a variety of, left the country from a variety of parts of India, but even within India, there was no single naming tradition. There was and still is the use of 4 names only for both religions, but with education, with literacy rates increasing in India, they have adopted Western naming traditions, especially when they leave the country. Now, note that there is a greater variety of names for Hindus, but Muslims have a narrower set of names which do not allow you to find out easily their region or place of origin, because essentially they are faith names, whereas Hindu names would allow you, if you are, to discern the origin in a more a logical way, but Muslim names, it's a bit more tricky because they're just faith names. Now, contrary to what many people think, there were actually a small number of Christians prior to arrival, but only from the south. However, there was nothing to indicate that they had already adopted Christian naming traditions. That said, I have actually seen on one register the name Thomas, which is very widely used in South India and especially in the state of Kerala. So it does seem that at least persons bearing the name Thomas came from South India to Trinidad already with that name. Next slide, please. Okay, so finding the emigration pass and the general register are key to unlocking your past. Now, the name that the emigrant gives, the emigrant being the person leaving India, gives to the immigration agent is transcribed on each of these documents. And on arrival, the name as it appears on the emigration pass is the first use of the name in your place of indenture. And it was usually only one name, a forename. And depending on when your family member arrived, which is a task you need to work out, the earlier the arrival after 1845, the more likely that you have a name that has really evolved with time and which might bear very little resemblance to the name that the emigrant gave on departure. However, the later the arrival in Trinidad, the more likely the name has survived, if not intact, but at least the way it sounded when they gave their name when they were leaving India. The exception to this is, of course, if you willfully provide a different name when you were leaving India, you might have done that for a number of reasons. But in a way, it doesn't really matter, does it? Because you've changed your name, you're going to build a new life. Unless you are very keen to find out who your ancestors were in India, the name when they left India is the name we are looking for. Okay, next slide, please. Now, what is the emigration pass? It sets out a great deal of data about the emigrant. Which became more detailed with time. At the beginning, it was more scant, but it sets out a variety of data entries on it, whereas a general register is like a database of all the names, but it should match the name on the emigration certificate of pass. Now, separate to all of that, we have the lists of ships. Now, here I was in some doubt about whether the ship list is the same as the general register, but after reading something on the UK archives, I think unless other people have better information, I think the ship list is separate to the emigration certificate and the general register. So there are three types of document on which you will find the names. Next slide, please. Okay, then now document data. Now, these are all the data entries that you will find on the emigration pass, the general register, and hopefully the ship list. A and F were the ones that would have followed you right through indentureship. You got a number which is like a unique identifier, and they would be of great assistance in finding out where the immigrant first settled. Now they're no longer an emigrant, they're now an immigrant because they've arrived in Trinidad. Now, one thing you should bear in mind, and it's something that I've only recently discovered, not everyone went to estates. People were indentured by government departments, in particularly what has become the Ministry of Works. People were indentured to lawyers, doctors, companies that were not necessarily involved in agriculture. They were just general workers. And the problem with that is that if you were not indentured to an estate, it's actually really quite hard to find out where you ended up in Trinidad. Because as we will see, if you were indentured to an estate, you tended to settle near the estate post-indentureship. You didn't have to. I mean, immigrants exercise free will. They went where they wanted to once indentureship ended, to the extent that they could. But if you were indentured to a lawyer or a doctor or the Ministry of Works, the chances of us being able to track where you went diminish, actually. Now, bear in mind that the data entries for your name will always have a margin of error. People transcribe names as they hear them. And in India, from what I have read, from what I've been told, most of the agents doing the transcription would have been fluent in local languages. Now, it is true that nevertheless, they were not written in Indian script, in whichever language. They were written in a way in which they could be understood in English. So it was a phonetic spelling. And that phonetic spelling should have been maintained in Trinidad. And it certainly would have been on the piece of paper, which was the emigration pass, which you kept with you. But whenever you came into contact with some sort of officialdom and you had to repeat your name, you were lucky, that they would spell it the same way it had been transcribed when you left India. And this is one of the biggest obstacles to finding out what your ancestor's name is, variations and corruptions in spelling in time. Now, next slide, please. Now here, let me try and illustrate it with an emigration pass, which is one of those I got as part of my own search to find my ancestors. Here we have a woman traveling with her 2 young sons. Bear in mind that the informal maximum age for women was 25 or even 30, and 30 or 35 for men. And under the India Act 1883, children had to be a minimum of 16 to be indentured, but children under that age could come, but they were not required by law to work. Now here you see that the data entries I described earlier are all set out there. In this case, this woman called Janaki, she is going to the estate Esperanza, which is on the right of the document, top right. She's traveling with 2 sons. You will see it says name of next of kin, and she says mother of 1449, which we will come on to in a moment. She lists no husband, and she has a scarf. Her place of origin is Umsin in Faizabad, which is in the northwest of India. She has a village, and she left via or through Calcutta in 1880. Now, the thing that's remarkable about this one is that she is not accompanied by a man. She comes on the Sheila, which is a ship that made many voyages. And you would see there are 2 numbers that identify. Now, for some reason in Trinidad, there are actually 2 numbers, where Fiji, for example, has 1. So she has number 63399. And she also has a depot number, which is 1448. Now, the depot number appears to be the most reliable one because it links her to her child, which is 1449. Next slide, please. Here we have the one of her sons, Ramcharoon. Now look carefully at that name. It's not really found as it is now spelt there in Trinidad. We have Ramcharan now. Open question. Has Ramcharan evolved from Ramcharoon? Now, interestingly enough, for the child, there is a father's name. So the child clearly has a father, but she hasn't listed a husband rather. The child has all the rest of the same data. One thing I didn't mention in the slide before is that her caste is indicated as being Sonar, which for those of you who know what that means, she is from the caste of goldsmiths. Now, So the rest of the data matches the mother, and it says son of 1448. And he gets depot number 1450. So 1449 is the older child. So we go to that, which is the next slide, please. Rene, next slide. Have I lost Rene? Next slide, please, Rene. Okay. Then here we have the older boy. And the older boy is the one she lists as her next of kin. Here we have another recognizable Trinidadian surname, Ramasur, except nowadays we don't say Ramasur. It is found widely in French-speaking colonies. It's found in Mauritius, but in Trinidad it's Ramessar or Ramassar, but it is not Ramasur. The open question is, has it evolved from this spelling? Now, so here's a woman traveling with two boys. She's sent to the estate of Esperanza. There's one other thing to note. They've crossed out at the very bottom of this emigration pass the need to work because he's a child, so it doesn't apply to him. So stay with those three names. Janaki is the woman's name. It's her sole name. We also have Ramcharoon and we have Ramesur. This is the emigration pass. This is what you're looking for, and you are looking for a name. Okay, you're looking for a name that matches yours. Next slide, please. Here's another emigration pass, but this is much harder to read. I did ask him for another copy. I'm very grateful to Alistair Sammy for allowing me to use his ancestors' emigration pass, which he discovered after a search with Shamsuddin, but it's impossible for you to read. So I'll try and tell you what it says. It's pretty much the same thing, except it's a South Indian family. They're from North Arcot in Madras. He's remarkably tall for the era. He's 5'6". He's on the outer limit of the age 30. His estate is Buen Intento, and the caste is Polygar. I emphasize that because Alistair is very proud of it. So, and as he's given me the honor of using the pass, it's one of the warrior castes of South India, and this is the name. The name is a complex collection of. It's a complex name. It's Narayan Sami Naidu. And he was a Telugu Indian, which means he didn't speak Tamil. He came from a different part of South India, which is now Andhra Pradesh. If you look at that collection of two names, you would hardly find, you would not find that in Trinidad today. You would find Sami. You would find Narayan. You may find Naidu, not necessarily spelt like that. But that name has not survived as it appears there now. So if your name is Narayan and you come across this, you might think it's your ancestor, but you will certainly have to do a lot more checking. If your name is Sami, I would have to say you would be disappointed because Sami was adopted as a name because it was far too complicated to give your name as Narayan Sami to most officials in Trinidad. People started to, it was either imposed on them or more likely, they started making their names more amenable to general use in the island. Okay, so the names did not survive intact. They had a greater chance of surviving intact the more recently you arrived, but nevertheless, they were subject to change. In order to be more widely accepted at schools or just generally. Next slide, please. So what is available at the National Archives? Now, I'm going to just deal with this now before I come on to the rest of my talk, and I'm conscious of the time, so I will try and speed up a bit. Now, the archives have done a great deal in the last few years. And in particular, they have worked closely with Shamsuddin, of whom most of you will have heard. And we owe him an enormous debt. He has helped me with my search. He is continuing to help me with my search, as is Anne helping me with my search. And you will see why later, why I think that searching for your ancestors, you should not simply go straight to the archives, because you might find a name which you think is yours, but which may not be your ancestor. And the only way to verify whether it is your ancestor or not is through you would have to undergo an entirely different process. You will have to check through what is available at the registry to see whether you can work backwards in time, find out if that person is indeed your ancestor. Luckily, many of the emigration certificates do survive, as do the general registers. Sadly, there are only 15 estate registers. There is a register of pre-existing marriages. There are ship registers. There is a remittance to India register, which shows that Indian immigrants were sending money back to their family in India. That is really worth perusing. There are bounty registers, which shows who was re-indentured and for how long. It seems that only 1 year was permitted. And there is a YouTube presentation which is really worth looking at. It was put up a year and a bit ago. It's only got 267 views, which is very surprising. So I've included the link for you, but it takes you right through what is available at the National Archives. Next slide, please. And here you have examples of what you can find at the National Archives. In the top right-hand corner, there is a screenshot of the remittance register, where I have managed to find someone who looks very much like an ancestor of ours, which is still to be verified. Certificate of exemption from labor you got after you had completed your indentureship. And there you see some additional documents which you might find very useful. The Register of Crown Land and Monies granted to Indian immigrants, redemption fees. Some of you don't know this. I only discovered recently, but after 3 years, if you had saved enough money, you could buy yourself out of your contract. And many people did that, in fact. There's a mortality register. There is, interestingly enough, passport register for immigrants who went to other parts of the British Empire. Money orders to India is a remittance register, and there is an interesting register of orphans, lepers, and paupers. Next slide, please. Okay, arrival and beyond. So now we are in Trinidad. The emigration pass, you've done your indentureship. You've basically decided to stay. What happens there? Next slide, please. Now, you want to find out who your ancestors are. The first place to start, as everyone says, is you need to establish your oral history. If you have anyone who's over the age of 80, I suggest you interview them. Even people in their 70s would have very little memory of anyone who came from India. But you should certainly try. If you are unable to do this, if you are actually doing this from abroad and you just know you have family in India, your task is made much harder, and you will have to focus on the documentary evidence that you're able to amass. One of the things that is missing, and I find this very regrettable, is that there is no proper map of the estates. Now, between 1845 and 1917, the island went through so many changes that even if you were to obtain a map of estates for 1845, it could be of very little use to you if your ancestor arrived in 1915. Not only was the island went through many changes in terms of agriculture, there was a major depression in the 1880s. Many estates were sold off. They became much smaller. People basically decided to rent land rather than use it for sugar cane farming, etc. There was such a diversity of events in Trinidad's history, and yet we do not have a comprehensive interactive map of estates. That's why I would suggest the land registry would be useful for our ancestors, but I think it is for you to start by trying to work out where in Trinidad is your oldest and closest connection. And that means, where do you think your family came from in Trinidad? Not where they lived now, but where your parents lived, or if at all possible, where your grandparents came from. Now, you could say, no, I'm not going to do this. I'm just going to go to the archives and look for a name that sounds like my name. Well, the difficulty with that, and I think you should certainly do that, because that's how you find the emigration pass. But I can only say that I found 150 Ramessars, and I'm staring at this list of 150 Ramessars, and I'm thinking, oh, which one is my Ramessar? I'm still looking for somebody from India who departed, who was a jeweler and who came to Trinidad and is my ancestor. So what I need to do, and here Anne has been enormously helpful, is to try and work out, well, where did my parents come from in Trinidad? Where did they say their grandparents came from in Trinidad? How long were they there for? That is the first clue you have. But you have to also bear in mind, when you're looking for documents in Trinidad, for such an incredibly small island, it is heavily subdivided into districts. So when you want to look for someone, you have to find out which district they came from. That is not an easy task. Next slide, please. Now, there is a special land grants register at the National Archives. Now, this can help you. If indeed your ancestor's name, or your name, or a name similar to yours, appears on one of these land grants. Now, the land grant system was a system which applied in a very ad hoc way. It was not very popular with the rest of the population, and you can understand why. For a limited period of time, until about 1880, although there is some evidence that it was still in operation until 1890. So I'm not entirely sure when it was finally stopped. And what it meant was that instead of giving you passage back to India, they would give you a grant of land. But they kept changing the terms on which you could get this land. You either had to have done 5 years indentureship plus 7 years residence. 1875 appears to be the peak year when it was taken up. So it's worth looking at the land register, of land grants register, which is held at the archives, not to be confused with the land registry, to see if a name which corresponds to a name in your family appears on the land grants register. But you didn't get a choice of land. Some people didn't even go and live there. So if you're trying to find other documents pertaining to your family in the area where, if you're lucky enough to find a name on the land grants register, it might be a blind alley, because people might have accepted the land, but they never ended up living in that area. And in fact, it's quite a small number of persons. It's 2,640 from what I could understand. So you'd be lucky to find your family name on that list. Next slide, please. However, the land registry might also be a useful source of information, because interestingly enough, by 1871, most of the Indians in the island were not indentured. They were simply resident, and they began to purchase land. So a search of the registry by 1880 would show ownership of by Indians of quite a lot of land and a number of houses. And this continued, up until the end of indentureship. These were mainly small holdings. There is one fascinating example of a purchase of a sugar estate, the Coriel sugar estate. And the owner, it seems, then requested indentured laborers. So it was, he took 25 indentured laborers for his estate. But a search of the land registry is very useful. Next slide, please. So we're coming back to the question of the name. So we are now in the 21st century. What is your name? What is your family name? Is it a Hindu, Muslim, or Christian name? And if you've been Christian, for how long have you been a Christian? The reason I ask that is because at a certain point in time, you would have been, apart from the minority who arrived as Christians, you would have been a Hindu or a Muslim. More likely Hindu than Muslim, because Muslims, it's more difficult for them to be converted. So identify the religious origin of your name. Now here it gets really tricky, because Hindu naming traditions, both in India and in the island, are notoriously multi-layered. As Anne has found to her cost, one of her comments to me is, there are so many name changes in your family. Widespread use of nicknames. Sometimes you only know someone by a nickname. In fact, it's only in a death notice that you will notice that, he has another name. And up until then, you would not have been aware that he was called by something else. And then there was, some names are just not names at all. In fact, what they are kinship names. So you'd call someone grandmother in another language. I mean, I set out 5 lines of text for Anne. Please look for the name Dadi. I had a breakthrough. And then Shamshuddin told me that means grandmother. Oh. And then I said to Anne, please delete this request. The name, it's not a name, it's just grandmother. Islamic names would be very hard for you to find a region of origin for, simply because they're faith names, and they're a narrow set of names. Conversion to Christianity, well, as you all know, the Presbyterian Church in particular had a great deal of success with conversion. Generally speaking, though, people did keep their surnames. With the Catholic Indian community, there was some variation to this. Many people adopted Joseph, Thomas, and Williams. And in particular, if they came from St. James, rumor had it that there was one priest that always said, take the name Joseph, when he was converting people to Catholicism. And there's also pretty much a stock set of Catholic conversion forenames that I have found, which is John, Rosalie, and Sarah. The difficulty with carrying a conversion name is that it makes it very difficult to find out what your other names had been. But it is not impossible, it's just more difficult. Now, conversion names were sometimes just used on official documents, but at school and at home, other names were used. Now, the difficulty with that is is my original point, that people are known by home names, and sometimes your descendants don't even know that you had another name. And if they simply don't. They remember someone as being called X, but in fact, they were officially called Y. Next slide, please. Now, here I give you some examples of an article I found as part of the diaspora writing. And I have attributed this article on the next slide, but you can see here how names have evolved in the Caribbean. Naipaul, for example, is a very, it sounds very anglicized, and it's unlikely to have ever been written like that in India. I am assured by Wikipedia that Prasad does not exist in India. It's only a Caribbean phenomenon. And you can see the variations of spelling of names within the Caribbean itself, according to this article. Like Suklal would be what the name would be in Trinidad. It would be spelled differently in Guyana and differently in Suriname. The same changes occurred with Tamil names, which are usually shortened. So the lady at the start of my presentation, who talks about Sami, meaning priest, but Sami was also an appendage to many Tamil names in use in Trinidad. And many people chose to keep Sami along with part of the appendage, like Cook Sami, Ram Sami, but many, many more just took Sami. Look at the differences in the spelling of Mutu, as it would be in India, compared to Mutu in Trinidad and Mutu, M-O-U-T-O-U in French colonies. And finally, there is some evidence of caste or clan names being used. Singh is very widely used in Trinidad, but you hardly find it as a surname of Sikhs. In the United Kingdom, for example, I have practically never come across it as a surname for a Sikh who comes directly from India to the United Kingdom. It is, though, used as a middle name by most of them. Pillai, for example, is said to be a clan name, but other people will, on the internet, will assert that it's a caste name. But in any event, it is an appendage to another name. Next slide, please. Islamic names, again, you see the same corruption and changes in names. But here you're looking at a much smaller stock of names, and there's nothing there to help you as to where the person would have come from. Note in particular, names ending in Inuddin, Edin, and Idin would have become in Trinidad Dean, 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 or Din in Guyana. Okay. Next slide, please. All I can say is the number of times I have found someone and found a name which sounds like ours, to have a family member tell me, but the spelling is different. Yes, well, there's not a lot we can do about that. So I think we should not insist on finding the same spelling as now. Next slide, please. Birth certificates. Oh dear, this is a really, really tricky topic for people of Indian descent. Requests for birth certificates must be applied for under the mother's so-called maiden name, and you must know the district of birth. I think this applies to all ethnicities in Trinidad. However, it is particularly relevant to those of Indian descent. In the period in question, up until 1945, it's very difficult to get an accurate birth certificate due to two things: the naming tradition and trying to establish the mother's name. Now, whilst it was a requirement to register a birth, marriages concluded under Hindu and Muslim rights were not recognized until 1936 for Muslim marriages and 1945 for Hindu ones. In any event, and I will come on to the marriage issue, not all births were registered. And there were a number of reasons for this. It was not only due to illiteracy, that, they didn't know they had to register them. It was just people wished to minimize their contact with the authorities. Now, it is also true, though, that with time, when children were born, many Indians did start to adopt the Western practice of giving a first name and a surname based on the father's first name. This, though, was a gradual, it was not an immediate practice. So if I go back to that boy who comes over with just a forename of Ramessieu, there's a pretty good chance that when he becomes an adult, he's still calling himself by one name, Ramessieu, but he has a child. He gives the child his name as the surname, and he most probably would have given the child a forename as well. And over time, Ramessieu probably evolved to Ramessar. Next slide, please. Now here's the timeline for marriage. Not many people know this, and I'm actually surprised there isn't more academic scholarship on this. Now, before you arrived, if you were already married and you were coming as a couple, you would get your marriage, your Indian marriage, concluded in India, registered on arrival. And there is actually such a register in the archives, by the way, of pre-existing marriages, as they're called. So that was fine. However, if you got married under Hindu rites or Muslim rites in the island, it was not recognized. There were systems put in place of voluntary registration or even civil marriage, where you could represent yourself to the authorities with your witnesses and go through the same process all over again, just like concluding a civil marriage. But very few people took advantage of that. And quite honestly, why should they, if in the eyes of their religion they were married? I think people just probably, I mean, for a number of reasons, it wasn't done. However, those who became educated knew to do it, whether they had retained their religion of being Hindu or Muslim. And certainly those who became Christian avoided this because Christian marriages were recognized. But if you were born to parents who had a marriage concluded under Hindu or Muslim rites up until 1945 for Muslim and 1936, that marriage was not recognized. Next slide, please. So the consequence of that is that there is no document attesting to a Muslim or Hindu marriage up until the time when the law was changed. If you find an old birth certificate from that period, illegitimate appears next to the child's name if the birth was registered. If you request a reissued certificate, nowadays it omits that. But I have in my possession a few old certificates and it says illegitimate. For me, that's not a stain. I think we have to move away from all of this. It's a consequence of history. Okay. The exception to this, as I said before, is that marriages under Christian rites were fully recognized, but watch out for name changes upon conversion. Next slide. Because of this problem, wills became commonplace in the Indian community, much more so than any other community other than the landed classes. For the simple reason that if you write a will, you can leave your property to whoever you please. If you fail to write a will, your property has to be administered by the state. And anyone who wants to get hold of the property then has to prove a link to you. So if there is no marriage certificate, if there is no proper birth certificate linking you to usually the man with the property, your life is that much harder. And as a result, there was a lot of litigation over this. Hence, the will became a device that was heavily used by the Indian community. However, these were very simple wills. They basically, next slide, please. They basically just left what they had to their family, whereas the wills that Anne showed us at the beginning of the month were complex wills, that went on for pages. The average Indian will for this in this period of time was very short. Now here's an example of a part of a will. And a couple of things to note about this will, as I think I posted it on the site before. This is a man, he's a Muthuswami on the first page, which I didn't copy because there was more personal data there. He says, I am called Muthuswami, but also Muthu, M-U-T-H-U. It's interesting that he makes his daughter the executrix. Now, there is some evidence that Tamil families were much more matrilineal in that it was not uncommon as well to leave land to the daughter. Note that they're only the four names in question are not names that you would find in common use today. And it's not clear if Muthuswami is Mr. Muthuswami. I think he's just Muthuswami. And most fascinating of all, he signs it in Tamil script at the bottom. And I got a Tamil speaker to look at it, and she perfectly understood it. So he wrote Tamil to a high level in 1918. Next slide, please. Here is an example of a birth certificate. It's a birth in Peru lands, which we now know to be St. James. And Peru lands, by the way, took no indentured labourers. It's a common misconception that they did, but Shamsuddin assures me that they didn't. Woodbrook took indentured labourers. Now look at the mother's name. I simply do not get that name. Is she called Archie? That was what the registrar heard. The given name of the child, in this instance, the given name of the child is Madra Muthu. There's nothing to indicate that that is a first name or a second name. Now, the informant is a man called Apple. Question, open question, and it's something that Anne hinted at in her presentation. Very often the informant, in a situation where they were not going to recognize the father, the informant is actually the father. So the mark X, he's illiterate, and the mark of Apo, labourer. Now, what would this man be doing registering this child if he were not the father? He cannot be registered as the father because it was presumably under a Hindu marriage. Now, this is a modern reissue of an old birth certificate, so they do not put that the child is illegitimate. Okay, next slide, please. Now, here we have a Muslim marriage certificate from 1939, and I've scored out the data. I hope you can't read it. Note that there is an entry for dowry, which does not appear on the Hindu certificate. It's the right hand, the extreme right of this. It gives the husband's age and name, his occupation, and the father's, the name of the father. Of the bride and the groom. This would have been issued once Muslim marriage was made legal in 1936. Next slide, please. And I found this one on the internet. I have scored out the information nevertheless. This is a Hindu marriage register from Hindu marriage from 1953. Now, the further consequence of the failure to recognize Hindu marriages and, by the way, cremation, which was not an issue with Muslims, is that Hindus could not bury their dead under the terms of their religion until 1953. This has consequences for those of you who would like to find your ancestors. Many people were buried on estates, but many people did use cemeteries. I would like to look into this further for personal reasons, but there's nothing more I can offer you on this. Next slide, please. So, if you're going to begin your search, If it's difficult to begin your search with a birth certificate of your parents or your grandparents, it's far easier to obtain a death certificate. But you nevertheless need a district and year in order to do so, which does make it very hard. So if you need a district, that means you should go back to the original starting point, which is where in Trinidad do you have your closest connection? Note, the data on a death certificate would only be as reliable as the informant. So if the informant is the clerk of the funeral home, he will know very little. If the informant is the nearest and dearest, they would know much more. If the informant is the youngest child who probably never spoke to the person who has died, they would know some, but not sufficient for it to be accurate. A common misleading factor is that the age of older people was often exaggerated on death certificates, okay? Because they were old, people thought they were incredibly old, but in fact they might have been much younger than was thought. Next slide, please. Here is a death certificate, which I obtained recently. Again, I can draw no personal conclusions from this, but again, it concerns the name Ramazar. Look at the spelling. There's a slight variation to the modern spelling. There are two R's. The informant is named Ciceran, but it's just one name that is given. So at that point in time, just one name is still being used. And there is an entry for the place of birth on death certificates for Trinidad and Tobago, and you will see in this instance it says India. Now, is that a reliable piece of information or not? As far as I'm concerned, the jury is a little bit out on this because it does rely on how much the informant knows. But I was told yesterday by a close relative who might be listening to this talk, I don't know if she is, that at that time, in order to bury someone, you needed to have a piece of identification. And the only piece of identification was a birth certificate. And if you did not have a birth certificate, it seems, thinking about what she said, that could only be because it was not registered or that you were born elsewhere. So I don't know, but that is basically what this death certificate says. Next slide, please. And I'm almost to the end, so you've put up with me for a long time. Religion. I just put this out there, some statistics from 1931. There was a review produced in 1945 after 100 years of Indian immigration. Now note the size of the population. It went up exponentially actually by 1951, but indentureship had pretty much ended by then. And note the number of Christians is more than the number of Muslims. Now this is relevant when we come to the next slide. So next slide, please, Rene. Clearly, Christianity makes finding records easier, especially if you belong to the Presbyterian community, which is very organized, is largely made up of descendants of East Indian immigrants, and has run two churches in particular, which are over 100 years old. That said, conversion will still impact your search for birth certificates for older people who would have been Hindu or Muslim. Clearly, if all your ancestors that you are searching for converted to Christianity, and you can find a birth certificate, marriage certificate, etc., which clearly sets it all out, you still don't clear the hurdle for the time at which they were Hindus and Muslims. Then you will still need to do a bit of probing. If they have changed their names, even more probing would be necessary. The Roman Catholic churches are actually very helpful. They serve a much smaller community, which are the Tamils near Port of Spain, including from French colonies. Most of them gather in that area, those who were Roman Catholic. That said, there are Tamils to be found scattered elsewhere in the island. But St. Patrick's Church, which is one of the oldest churches in the island, is very helpful with giving you baptism data. The problem with the baptism data is that it sets out baptism names, because I'm only guessing, but they probably didn't want complicated Tamil names being given to them upon baptism. In some instances, those were the names that were retained for official use, but in other instances, not. I was able to obtain baptism records, and it said in one case that my father's godparents were John and Sarah, and I was thinking, who are John and Sarah? You know, John and Sarah. I mean, next slide, please. Now, your resources elsewhere. There's a great deal out there for you to check, which is online, whereas I think Trinidad is lagging behind a bit. The UK archives are getting better, but finding names at the UK archives, that is unusual. That said, when names do appear, it's surprising the context in which it could appear. I managed to find a pensioner with a surname I was looking for who got a gratuity because he was working for the Ministry of Works in 1917 in Trinidad, and for some reason that was at the National Archives. UNESCO, the Indian Migration Route project that I mentioned at the beginning is clearly of interest. But Mauritius and South Africa have their lists online. And the Surinamese list can be found in the Netherlands. Now, this website is available in both Dutch and English. However, the English version is not as good as the Dutch. So at some points you get blocked. But it is worth persevering, and you can always write to them and they would help you because most of them speak very good English. The emigration passes for Fiji have been put online by the government of Australia under some project of collaboration. I found a document for Grenada, which is quite helpful. Martinique is, there is an association which has transcribed all of the Indian immigrants who remained in Martinique. However, that does not tell us what we want to know about those who have left Martinique and come to Trinidad, which is what I am particularly interested in. Next slide, please. Mixed relationships with non-Indians. I think mixing occurred from the very beginning. The question, though, is how you find that out, and how it helps you to find who your ancestors are. DNA testing is clearly useful in this respect. But if the mixing was in an established relationship, it was more likely than not it would have been in a Christian setup, in which case your search is actually made easier. Now, DNA testing can throw up that you were Indian when you didn't know you were, or it can throw up that if you are Indian, you have something else in you. In almost all instances, it's the same point, that is probably someone in Trinidad of a Christian background. So some probing is necessary. The only difficulty there is, of course, if it is something that was not declared. So they were not in an established relationship, then it's going to be quite hard. That's all I can say. So here again, if you want to know what your family history is, the best way to start is to speak to your oldest surviving family member and then take it from there, and then get on the road to finding death certificates, birth certificates, and in a parallel track, check the archives, looking for a name that looks like yours. But bear in mind, there will be many. Next slide, please. And I leave you with two thoughts. One from Walcott about his visit to Felicity, which is an Indian settlement which was established very near to an estate. And next slide, please. So you can read this in slow time. I leave you with another quote, this time from Naipaul. It's more apt. You should juxtapose it with a quote from Walcott, who is someone from an urban environment in the time he lived in Trinidad, going for a drive to the country to see something that was clearly Indian. And he was an outsider looking in. Here is an insider looking at himself. As far back as when he left Trinidad at the end of the 40s, he says, "We made no inquiries about India or about the family we had left behind. When we wished to know, it was too late." My only message to you is, I don't think it's too late. We can do it. So my last slide. Thank you, Rene. My last slide. There is a monument in Calcutta to those that left. There isn't one in Madras. The address is 21 Garden Reach, Calcutta, is the depot. And the final slide, I'd like to thank everyone who helped me. Indrani, my sister, above all, Shamsuddin, above all, we all owe him a huge debt. Shairoon, she knows who she is, but that's the second family we discovered. But this group, and Anne, and my daughter Ava, for the help with the slides. Thank you very much. That's it, I'm done.
If anyone has questions, please go ahead. Yes, go ahead, Anne, go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to say this was a fabulous presentation. I learned a lot and I thought I knew a lot, but it was absolutely amazing. And thank you so much for participating.
That's okay. The problem is there are some in the group who are very advanced with their search, and there's some that I think are struggling to know how to start. And I remember when I rang you, Anne, and it was just before lockdown, and I could sense a panic in your voice. Oh my God, it's Indian roots, it's Indian roots. And I said, no, I really want documents. I want documents about, I want birth certificates and death certificates because I don't have any. And then I realized that I had to do this in a parallel track. So at the same time, I've been working with Shamsuddin to find out about my family. But because of you and this group that I found, there's the death certificates, relevant birth certificates, but also I found, my grandfather's name in the yearbook.
Yeah.
I didn't even know yearbooks existed.
Yeah. But it was an absolutely amazing presentation. So detailed. Congratulations.
That's okay. I'm happy to take questions, but I don't know what they are.
Julie, Sean had asked a question in the chat much earlier. Was there deed poll for Christian conversion? I'm not sure what that means, but I don't know.
Oh, deed poll, in that you had to go and a deed poll you use when you change your name.
Right.
No, so Christian conversion deed poll, that I don't know. That's a very interesting question, because to change your name nowadays, you have to do a deed poll. I very much doubt they did it then, unless you had already had a document with your name on it from the state, in which case with conversion, you would have had to do a deed poll. Yes, you're right. But if you didn't, if your name appeared on no document, conversion wouldn't matter.
Anne, your hand is up again.
Yes. In order to look for a deed poll, you actually are looking through the index of deeds, because someone had asked me to search for a name change for their Chinese ancestors, and I did not know where to begin. And I spoke to a friend of mine who's an experienced title clerk, and she told me that deed polls are registered in the index of deeds. So what they will have is they will have from and to, and the from would be the old name and the to would be the new name. And so you can search down via the deed indexes to locate a deed. And then once you find that deed number with the corresponding names, if it's not on the registrar's database, you could request to have it uploaded. And once it's uploaded to the registrar's database, you can then get a copy of that deed. But I agree with Julie, back in the day, it was not as strict as now. I mean, I think anybody can come and say, this is my name in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and nobody would really, have to go through all this legal process, especially for people who were some impoverished and had to pay a lawyer and all that kind of thing. I don't think it was as strict back in the day. But yeah, there are some changed names that are changed from old names to new names, and you can find out in the index of deeds.
I see, and so there's another question. How has DNA testing impacted research, if at all? I think it's had a huge, at least my personal experience is that DNA testing has confirmed our oral history, that we were South Indian with a part North Indian, a significant part North Indian, but otherwise South Indian. And I've done 23andMe and Ancestry. Now, as you know, with DNA testing, it's only as good as the data it's got within the database. So it only reflects back at you what it is they can match you with. And that's why it's only become of interest for ethnic minorities, visible minorities, and more recently, as more of them use it, it becomes more useful. Now, the biggest customers of DNA testing that are Indian actually live in the United States, and not in the United Kingdom, interestingly enough. I don't think it's used as much there, and it's not used that much in India at all, from what I gather. So the data they have would be based on the Indians in the United States, and they are predominantly from the South. So it was the results we received really did reflect our South Indian makeup, but the North Indian makeup was it was broken down. I mean, in our case, they said that we were a mixture of South Indian and far north of India, as in nearer to Pakistan. So I have tried to now hone in, because I'm still looking for the Ramesar name. I have tried to hone that list of 150 Ramesars, which actually does, if you go back to the emigration pass, it lists the area and the village. I have started culling those names which are from other parts of India and looking at the map of India as it existed then. That's partly why I've given you the map from 1893, because the districts in India keep changing as well, which is not helpful. And the names, they have re-Indian, I don't even know what the word would be, but they have the names that were written in a more anglicized way, and they've now changed those. And I've tried to find out if I can match it to an area that is in the far north. But DNA testing obviously will show up if you have another ethnicity. And there, of course, how that ethnicity arrives in your genetic makeup is a question for you to find out in terms of your own personal family history. And sometimes it is unclear. So whereas there was always this rumor to this day that there were many children on estates that were fathered by the owners or the employees. But in Indian families, it wouldn't necessarily always be so obvious, but it would come across in DNA testing, certainly. But that would never have been from an established relationship. It could have been, but hardly ever, I think.
You have a question for Melissa. Melissa asked, how are the ship records different from the immigration pass and general register?
That is something that is a bit unclear to me, because I listened to the one on from the National Archives, and it's quite clear that they have ship lists. And then I went to the UK site and I saw they talked about ship records. And at one point I thought, hang on a moment, this is the same as the General Register. And then that's why I put a question mark on the slide. I think it is, I don't think the data is different. There might be less of it, but I think it's fundamentally the same. It might be just the belonging to the shipping company. I don't know is the real answer to that. It's still something I was mulling over.
Terence asks, how do you get the immigration pass? And will there be for someone coming from Guadeloupe?
Okay, Indrani, that is definitely a problem we have as well, because in our case, we have been told that our family, at least an ancestor, came from Martinique to Guadeloupe, from Martinique to Trinidad. And as we understand it, many people came from Martinique to Trinidad and from Guadeloupe to Trinidad. It would not, my gut feeling, but we can inquire at the archives, is that it would not be held in Trinidad. It would be held, if it's held at all, in Martinique or Guadeloupe, unfortunately, if that was their point of first arrival.
Sean wants, go ahead.
Sorry, with that particular ancestor, he had left with his 2 children from Pointe-à-Pitre. No, sorry, where the volcano had taken place.
Yes, well, if they had, I think that there were many that came over after the volcano in 1902. So they would have been then, as far as Martinique is concerned, in Martinique for quite some time. But I have no idea what the French government did with emigration passes. That the answer to that question lies with, I can ask Shamsuddin, I can commit to asking him that, and our National Archives, and I can send an email to the Martinican authorities. But that's the most, I'm sure it's in Martinique. There is a statistic on how many migrants returned as a percentage. There is a very good book on which I based some of this research called A Question of Labor by someone called Lawrence. And the book is available online, but you can download it, but you can't copy, you can't screenshot or anything. I noticed somebody in the group was selling it a couple of years ago. I don't know if that person is listening, but that book will give you those statistics. It's called A Question of Labor by a study of immigration 1875 to 1917 by K.O. Lawrence, and it deals with British Guyana and Trinidad. But I think the majority stayed.
Julie and Indrani, have you made any research trips to India and got into the villages and talked to people?
I've made one trip to India, to South India, but it was for tourism. This was before my interest in genealogy, which has come to me quite late in life. So the answer to that is no. However, Shamsuddin will help you find your ancestors in India, but in order to do that, you first have to find your ancestors that left India. I have started trying to find out what the Indian archives have available, and they have a great deal, but dealing with them online is actually quite tricky. From what I can see, you need to use a credit card. There's a lot of stuff that is freely available, but it doesn't have names. And if you listen to that YouTube presentation, you will see that our archives call on India to increase collaboration in relation to archives.
I have been to Pakistan on many occasions, well, several occasions actually, on business, but it's not been in relation to researching our genealogy at all. But what's interesting is that when I was in Pakistan on one occasion, there was someone who told me that the particular earrings that I was wearing, they were made in Trinidad. And he said, that particular jewelry we no longer see in Pakistan. But I remember when I was a youth, that was the sort of jewelry the goldsmiths used to make. And it just, these are various indicators that just go to show that the majority of the immigrants who came to Trinidad were from North India, really, when you think of it.
I think there's a feeling that a lot of cultural icons crystallized with time, whereas they evolved elsewhere. I think jewelry is one.
Yeah, that's so true of diasporas, right? Like the people who left end up preserving things that don't get continued in the points of origin. I just find doing ancestral trips can add such a great layer, and you never know. Going to a village, you might just bump up into someone that says, "Oh, you are one of us," and they give you the whole story.
Any other questions? Because I'm happy to try. We're happy to try. No? I would say the one thing that Sean's presentation last week about how you use the online newspapers is also very relevant for us as a community. That said, the instances when a new community, such as ours, to the island, would have been drawn to the attention of the newspapers was not always favorable, if you see what I mean. So the early instances, if you look at the archives, you'd find people's names, which is helpful, but it's usually when they're before the courts. But as time progresses, as they settled down, you'd find things like football teams, etc., achievements, educational achievements. But this is in the more recent online digital archives in the latter part of the 19th century. Apart from the Presbyterian community, it has. I mean, we could do a talk on that alone, but somebody else would have to do it. They were much more organized from quite early on, and they were much more successful from early on in terms of their acceptance in the wider society. So the online archives have a great deal about them. It's.
Patricia is asking, did you find linkages to the Portuguese settlers?
You mean in terms of the Portuguese in Trinidad, or the link to Goa? Because there is, again, you'll have to go back to the one man in Trinidad who knows so much about Indian roots, and that's Shamsuddin, who will tell you whether anyone came from Goa. But in Trinidad, that would only be in terms of personal relationships. So in my case, that does not appear to be relevant. I have not myself found any.
Yes, she was referring to Trinidad. Yeah.
Trinidad.
Yeah. You're receiving a lot of compliments from people on your presentation, you and Indrani. Just letting you know that.
Thomas, thank you. We're both very pleased, but I think that we've probably exhausted you, because I don't think there's any more questions.
Or maybe you could discuss who's on next week, or is it tomorrow? Sorry,
yes. Yeah. Tomorrow we have there is one tomorrow, and Anne, would you like to tell us a little bit more about?
Yes, Carol Regis is on tomorrow. That's our final Zoom presentation for this month, and she will be discussing her journey and tracing her Portuguese ancestors, her African ancestors, and her British ancestors, European ancestors, all mixed up in one, because she is a mixture of all of these various communities, and she will guide us through and our month-long Let's Talk Genealogy, which I have to thank everybody who has participated. It has been an absolutely amazing journey. I've learned so much, and I'm so thankful to all those that participated. So Carol will be on tomorrow at 2:00 Trinidad time, and that will close us off until, I guess, next year. We have to do this again in 2023. I have some ideas that I'm kind of... Oh, hi, Carol. There's Carol. Carol, you could say a little word.
Thank you so much, Julie. You guys were enlightening. I must say, I grew up in Chaguanas, and you have made my eyes popped with every word. I can identify with the surnames, Naipals, the Singhs. You just name names, and I could identify with it. I went to Chaguanas Vedic School only for 1 year, but the experience is there, and everything you spoke about, I could identify with it because I saw it firsthand. And, it's amazing. I lived in a diaspora that, like you said, was not, conducive to knowing their history in as much as knowing that they had ancestors come, due to indentureship. But it's so amazing to hear more about it. And I congratulate you again. So
thank you. But
you give me a good head start.
I really look forward to your talk. And one of the things that is different for Indian roots compared to African roots is that for some reason, they did not send us systematically, in any event, a copy of the emigration passes and the general registers to London. That would have made our life far, far easier. These are only available in Trinidad, and they have not yet put them online, but they will do. They've said they're going to do it. Every other country so far has done it. But for African roots, certainly if we're talking about the 1851 census, but we're talking also about there was a registry of slaves. A copy was deposited in London, and that is now available.
That's amazing. That's amazing stride. I mean, it starts with baby steps, and I think with the interest that we have growing with ancestry, this is opening up a whole new portal for everyone. And I mean, with regards to a mixed population, which most of the colonies had developed having over time, people have all of these makeups. Like, for instance, I do. I chose to elaborate on the topic because of the fact that when I do my DNA, it was enlightening to me because we grew up not knowing much about our past. It's not something that we were taught in school. It was just specks of information here and there. We weren't, I grew up in Trinidad and I was born in the 60s, the late 60s. So going to school, picture the 70s. It was like pretty daunting. You don't know what you just came out of. And we were taught what they pretty much had. We didn't have access to libraries and things of this nature. So our history was, encapsulated in format that, I don't know, whoever decided to write the books, that people who came and things like that. And that's what we knew. So doing my DNA had opened up a whole new portal for me, and it had me hungry. Start off as a curious venture, end up with an appetite for genealogy, and it put me straight back into school, understanding geography and our history, because it doesn't go without saying, you have to have some history, you have to have geography, you have to have a lot of components to do this genealogy journey. So, like you said, when you described about the surnames and the corruption of surnames, I could identify with it because it's across the board. It's not, with one group or one ethnicity, as a matter of fact. So, you know, that's a thorn when we do research, trying to find someone and then their names are misspelled or it's just eroded over time.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the areas where we would need more research is estates. And I would really call on those, particularly members of the group, that know more about the ownership of estates and the documents available on the estates, because we only have 15 estate registers at the archives. Right. And Indians went to total, in that 72-year period, a total of 267 estates. And that means that if you're going down the route of estates, you are hardly likely going to find your ancestor unless they happened to be from one of those 15 estates, which, surprise, surprise, happen to be the very, very big ones at the tail end of indentureship. But yet, if you look, that's 267 estates, some of which were very, very small. So if anybody is out there listening who comes from a background where they might know a bit more about those estates, we would very much like to see what documents there are. And I noticed that some law firms in Trinidad have started giving their old archives.
Yes, that's amazing.
To UWI. And that is a really good move. The problem is they're not accessible online, so you have to go to UWI, and they show property ownership for that period, because at least one of the law firms represented the landed class in Trinidad, and to hand over their old archives, I think, is a real act of generosity to the nation.
I have a quick question.
We're talking about sugar estates, coconut estates, cocoa estates as well. And I would be very intrigued to know what became of the records of Caroni Limited.
Oh, that's a good one. That's a very good one.
The National Archives, I believe, Caroni has handed over a lot of their old records, but they're still sorting it out. So what you all could do is be in contact with the National Archives to find out about those Caroni records, because I'd heard that sometime earlier this year that they were handed over. But I think the challenge with estate records is, would these records have been privately held and not?
Yes, that is the challenge.
Yeah, and with as years go by, won't they just have been destroyed? I mean, I don't know anything about estate records.
I don't know. You see that
National Archives.
I would be very surprised. I think the heirs of some of those, for instance, the cocoa proprietors and so on, they have kept documents. I would
even the rum producers.
But these would be in private hands, is whether or not private hands would, because in the French Creole community, when Father Devatai did a lot of his research and wrote a lot of his books, because of who he was able to access a lot of personal records of the French Creole community. But I'm thinking, even in my own family, there was a story, a cousin of mine, her mother had died, and there were a whole box of old family photographs, people that she could recognize, but she rented out the house, and these people tossed everything under the house. So a couple of years later, when she's back and going through the house and so forth, all these old photographs of family members were like molded and wet and just had to be tossed out. So I'm just wondering if a situation like that may have also happened with a lot of these estates, especially, as you said, the cocoa estates, the small sugar estates and stuff like that. If their records could have been just tossed aside as not important.
Absolutely.
And that's a huge loss. A huge loss.
I mean, they must be somewhere in a place where that has been abandoned. I mean,
not even in the land records you would find traces of indentureship. You would just find the deed that describes the land and who it was sold to and who had owned it before, but nothing to list who worked on the property. But the Caroni records, reach out to the National Archives. I think they're going to make it public, but I don't know when. I think right now what they're doing, they're sorting and classifying all those old Caroni records. But even so, how far back does Caroni go? I think there was a company prior to Caroni.
Yes, there was. Yes,
I can't remember. It's whether or not they have those records or just the Caroni estate records, because those older records from the company before would also be extremely valuable and important.
Yes,
Yeah,
that makes
and
sense.
that might be in London.
Or might be in London.
Sorry.
What was the name of that estate? What was Caroni called before Caroni was Caroni?
Is it Usain Madeline, or is that a
it was a
separate?
different entity. It was Tate
It's a
and Lyle.
name. It's like a British name.
Yeah.
I can't remember now.
It was
though.
Tate and Lyle.
Right.
Tate and Lyle.
Yes.
Yeah.
Tate and Lyle. Something to that effect. Yes. Yes. So yeah, maybe the British Archives might have records from them.
Yeah, I mean, we could, but I mean, the assumption then is that most Indians, I mean, that's only those Indians who went to Caroni, if you see what I mean. I mean, they went all over the western
island.
part of the island, and then their land grants. They were. I mean, this is the other problem. The land grants were to places where they didn't necessarily live either.
Right. But the land grants, there might be hope for that, because there are a lot of colonial land grants, but they come under like RPO numbers. And these numbers, they have hundreds of books with those records, but you need to know the number, the RPO number, in order to access the grant. Because I think in my presentation, I had shown a colonial land grant, but I was able to find that because I knew the number. So there is the possibility of finding those grants that were given to Indian indentured laborers, but it's to know the number of the grant in order to request it from the registrar.
So there is a connection between, yes, because according to the presentation of the National Archives, there's a separate land grant register.
But
as
at
well.
the registrar, at the registrar.
Registrar, you will.
But I don't think there is like an index for that, and I must inquire about that, because under those colonial land grants, then yes, you should find those that were granted land under those RPO numbers. So I'll make some inquiries and email you and let you know.
Okay.
Sean made a great point just now.
Well,
sorry, Carol.
Sean Need, he said something just now about the estate.
He said Tate and Lyle bought out most of the estates. Caroni was one estate, and another was purchased that was integrated into it. I kind of got the feeling Esperanza was integrated into it, but then maybe that's... My father worked for H.E. Robinson, and his estates were sold to Tate and Lyle and became part of Caroni. Yes, he's saying it's Esperanza. Which, by the way, is apparently at the archives. The archives does have Esperanza.
Was one of the estates. There was Woodford Lodge. There were a couple of others that were merged. But, before Tate and Lyle, there was also, curiously, there were the Kleinwood Benson was the owner. Whether they were the beneficial owner or just trustees, we don't know. Were they acting, holding on trust for someone else? That we don't know. And that was before Tate and Lyle.
So the estate route of finding your ancestors has its limitations, because there isn't that much of the archives. So the next thing is, where did your ancestors settle in Trinidad first? Which gives you a pretty good indication of maybe where they were indentured. Maybe not. You have to remember that people weren't sheep just because they came under bonded labor. A lot of them deserted, although they were penal contracts. By the way, the penalty for desertion, if you were found, was prison. They weren't civil contracts; they were penal contracts. But it didn't stop people deserting, and the desertion rate was quite high amongst Tamils. Also, Tamil indentureship was not successful in the Caribbean, whereas it was highly successful in South Africa and in other parts. But it seems that amongst those that deserted, they left the island. According to Shamsuddin, many of them went to Venezuela, which I didn't know Indians went to Venezuela, but they did. And then they came back after quite a while, presumably under a new name. I mean, it's fascinating. It shows that people had agency.
relative connections like that, where you never thought the person would end up in such a place, but they did. And you can find traces of it because DNA just leaves that trace, but it's confusing to add, to your tree, someone you don't have that detail.
Tiny bit of evidence I found when I was doing the French research was that some people were deported to Devil's Island and they found themselves in Trinidad because they somehow or the other, a little bit like Papillon, the film, you can find this in the newspapers. I'm not saying these were Indians. There was one Indian who somehow or the other got to Devil's Island and then came back to Trinidad, but there were others. They got this, I don't know if they had a makeshift boat, but then they passed themselves off in the population for years before the French discovered that they were escapees from Devil's Island.
Well, survival skills. Right? Survival skills. For some reason, we end up here after having over 68,000 ancestors to develop us. It takes that much people to come together, coming down the line to create us. So just imagine, right? Going back in time, it makes a big difference why we are here. So you're special today. Everyone on this chat here realize how special they are. It took so many people to form our DNA today. So our history, volume is more than we can pinpoint. It's vast.
Well, on that, I have nothing more to add. I'd just like to thank Rene for all his help in putting this together and his patience with my multiple slides, which I know he had a sinking feeling when he saw them.
No, of course not.
Thank Anne for organizing this. And I've loved the talks so far. I'm sorry I missed yours, Joel, but I listened to it. And I look forward to Carol's tomorrow.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you. We appreciate you.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, great, folks. Well, I'm going to end the meeting shortly, and we'll see you all when we see you all.
Well, you'll see us tomorrow.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. All right, bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.